The heavy, condensation-slicked glass door of the climate-controlled botanical sanctuary slipped completely from my grip. It swung inward on its failing, poorly calibrated hydraulic hinge and slammed shut with a concussive, echoing thud that violently rattled the expensive, blooming ghost orchids lining the perimeter walls. Instinctively, my hand shot out to steady a wildly swaying terracotta planter, balancing on the edge of a tiered wrought iron stand, but my elbow clipped a low-hanging ficus branch instead. Cold, filtered water from the automated overhead misting system dripped directly down the back of my neck, sending a sharp, localized chill down my spine. The 60-page supply chain dossier I had been meticulously reviewing slipped from my clumsy fingers. The heavy stacks of printed paper scattered across the damp, uneven flagstone path, the corners instantly soaking up the ambient humidity. My heavy work boot had caught on a thick, exposed root system protruding from the soil bed exactly 3 seconds after I entered the room. It was a familiar, frustrating failure of spatial awareness. Sorry, I muttered to the empty, humid air, dropping to my knees quickly to gather the dampening spreadsheets before the black printer ink completely bled into the fiber of the pages. So, incredibly sorry about that. Are you apologizing to the Phalaenopsis, Beau? Or to my door hinges? I jerked upright entirely too fast, nearly knocking my head against a low-hanging, galvanized steel support beam that held the massive glass ceiling in place. Regina Bennett stood at the far, shadowed end of the sprawling greenhouse, framed by a vibrant wall of incredibly rare, flowering hybrids. She was 38, the founder and active CEO of Bennett Botanicals, and the only person operating in this entire city who legitimately intimidated me. Not because of her wealth, my own private portfolio was vastly larger, though entirely hidden behind a complex, labyrinthine network of agricultural shell companies, freight line holdings, and blind trusts, but because she operated her life and her business with a terrifying, flawless precision I could never mimic. She wore a sharp, immaculately tailored emerald blazer over practical, dark work jeans, her smartphone pressed tightly to her ear. "The door," I said, finally gathering the ruined papers into a messy, uncoordinated stack against my chest, ensuring the most sensitive logistical data faced inward. And the ficus. I think I bruised a lower leaf when I swung around to catch the planter. She didn't offer a polite smile. The skin around her eyes was pulled tight, drawn thin by a specific, high-frequency stress I recognized intimately from my own brutal industry. Her breathing grew shallow, her fingernails digging small, pale crescent moons into the leather backing of her phone case before she finally lowered the device. The glass screen was completely shattered, a spider web of violent cracks originating from the top right corner where it had clearly met a hard surface at high velocity. "Cade just officially rejected the secondary distribution compromise," she said. Her voice was hollowed out, entirely stripped of its usual resonant authority by a sudden, massive spike in adrenaline. He's citing the exclusivity clause embedded in the original 2021 agreement. He wants 30% of our gross revenue across the board, or he permanently cuts off our access to the entire East Coast supply lines by Friday afternoon. The torn spreadsheet edge stuck to my palm. 30% wasn't a raid, it was a slow execution. I didn't need to request a breakdown of her operational overhead. At that specific margin, her cash flow would bleed out within 90 days. The financial overhead on delicate agricultural perishables was brutal, requiring precise, temperature-controlled transit. Cade Peterson, the CEO of Omni Distribution, held the logistical chokehold on premium botanical transport in this region. He wasn't negotiating a fair market rate. He was executing a deliberate, hostile starvation tactic designed to force a collapse. If Regina didn't sign the amended contract, her extremely valuable flowers would rot in unrefrigerated transit warehouses. If she did sign, her profit margins would implode, and Omni would buy her bankrupt company out for pennies on the dollar within 6 short months. That exclusivity clause is only legally triggered if you fail to meet the baseline shipping volume for the quarter, I said, stepping forward carefully, making absolutely sure to step over the thick, protruding root this time. Your yields have been tracking 20% above the mandated quota since April. I know the clause, Beau, she snapped, rubbing her temple with 2 fingers. The tailored emerald blazer suddenly looked entirely too large for her shrinking, exhausted frame. Henderson Farms is our primary supplier for the rare earth hybrids. Cade didn't attack our yield. He just bought the private access road leading directly to Henderson's property. He's implementing a massive, mandatory toll protocol that technically delays the outgoing shipping trucks just long enough to cause a deliberate volume breach at the regional hub. It's a manufactured, entirely fabricated default. A legal trap. She turned sharply away from me, pacing rapidly down the narrow, humid aisle between the propagation tables. Her shoulders were rigid, locked in place by sheer, unbroken willpower. She was trapped in the ruthless corporate spin cycle, completely terrified that stopping to breathe for even a single second would let Cade win the war and dismantle her father's legacy. "I need a temporary, legal workaround," she said, her voice tight, vibrating with an anxious, desperate energy that caused her hands to tremble. "A verified logistical reason to bypass his specific trucks and his specific road? If I can reroute the entire shipment through an independent, third-party carrier by Friday, the volume breach technically doesn't happen. I know you work in logistics. I know you have contacts in freight forwarding. I can pay a premium for a rush job." I did. I owned the freight lines. I owned the massive, diesel-electric locomotives pulling the refrigerated cars across the state line. I owned the intricate web of rail spurs that connected the fertile Midwest directly to the bustling coastal ports. I even owned the exact soil Mr. Henderson grew his premium product in, though neither Henderson nor Regina knew that. I was the silent, majority partner in a dozen major agricultural systems, a position I fiercely maintained because I absolutely hated the public spotlight and the endless, shallow networking it demanded. "I can easily provide the logistical workaround you require," I said, walking over to a heavy metal potting bench and dropping my ruined papers onto the surface with a soft slap. "But you need to sit down." She stopped pacing abruptly and turned to glare at me, her dark eyes flashing with irritation. "I don't have time to sit down, Beau. I have exactly 72 hours before Cade locks the entire East Coast out of my system and suffocates my distribution. Your fine motor control is actively failing?" I pointed out gently, refusing to back down from the intensity of her glare. I gestured toward her hands. "You dropped your phone recently. The screen is shattered. You are operating on a severe, prolonged sleep deficit, which is actively impairing your strategic processing capabilities. The workaround requires me to review the entire 2021 contract line by line to ensure compliance. I will review it. You will sit in that chair for exactly 15 minutes. She stared at me, the aggressive fight still blazing in her eyes, but her physical endurance was audibly hitting the red line. Her breath hitched. She looked down at the cracked phone resting in her palm, her thumb tracing the jagged lines of shattered glass. 15 minutes, she whispered, the remaining fight suddenly draining out of her posture. She walked slowly over to a worn, comfortable rattan chair, nestled deeply between two massive, overarching ferns at the back of the room. She sat down heavily, the woven fibers creaking under her weight, and rested her head in her shaking hands, leaning forward until her elbows hit her knees. I walked back over to the metal potting bench, grabbed a thick stack of clean paper towels from a dispenser, and began carefully, methodically drying my ruined spreadsheets one by one. The ink had blurred slightly, but the structural data remained legible. I had the exact legal opening I needed to utterly dismantle Cade Peterson, and I didn't need to swing a hammer to do it. I just needed the paperwork, the zoning maps, and a precisely timed application of leverage. The next morning, the air outside was crisp, smelling faintly of distant car exhaust and fresh overnight rain. I arrived at the Omni Distribution Glass and Steel headquarters at precisely 0900 hours. The soaring, minimalist lobby was aggressively modern. A sterile environment composed entirely of polished white marble and sharp, unyielding architectural lines. It smelled distinctly of expensive, chemical air freshener and cold, calculating ambition. I wore a wrinkled, tan linen shirt and loose khakis, looking exactly like the overworked, perpetually underpaid, mid-level logistics coordinator I pretended to be when dealing with aggressive corporate predators. Cade Peterson was waiting inside a massive, soundproofed, glass-walled conference room on the 40th floor, overlooking the city skyline. He was 40 years old, slick, his dark hair perfectly styled, wearing a custom-tailored charcoal suit that cost more than a reliable used car. He looked at me like I was a localized inconvenience tracked in on the bottom of someone's boot. Ian Edwards, my impeccably dressed, terrifyingly sharp legal counsel, stood quietly by my side holding a slim, black leather briefcase. Ian's suit was immaculate, completely contrasting with my deliberate dishevelment. "I don't deal with Bennett's delivery boys," Cade sneered, leaning back lazily in his expensive ergonomic chair. A half-full ceramic cup of steaming dark coffee rested dangerously near his open, high-end laptop. Tell Regina the 30% offer expires at noon tomorrow. She signs the dotted line, or her beautiful, delicate flowers turn to worthless compost by the weekend. I moved forward to take the leather chair directly across from his position. My heavy work boot caught the thick, protruding edge of the polished aluminum table leg. I stumbled forward awkwardly, my center of gravity failing entirely, my elbow slamming hard into the surface of the table. The kinetic impact transferred instantly, knocking Cade's expensive coffee cup directly onto his open, glowing laptop keyboard. The hot, dark liquid seeped instantly into the delicate mechanical keys. The high-resolution screen flickered wildly, sputtered with a faint, dying electronic hiss, and went entirely black. "Are you absolutely kidding me?" Cade roared, jumping to his feet so fast his heavy chair rolled backward and hit the glass wall with a loud bang. He frantically tried to shake the scalding hot coffee off his tailored suit pants, cursing loudly. "You clumsy idiot! That's a $3,000 machine." "I am so incredibly sorry," I said, my voice rising in genuine, high-pitched panic as I frantically grabbed a huge handful of dry napkins from the center console. I aggressively dabbed at the ruined electronics, effectively and deliberately pushing the sticky liquid deeper into the sensitive motherboard. My boot caught the edge of the metal. "I'll replace it, absolutely. I'll write a check right now. I am so sorry." "Get your clumsy hands off it," Cade shouted, shoving my arm roughly away from the table, his face flushed with unadulterated rage. I stepped back quickly, my hands raised in a visible posture of complete apology and physical surrender. The distraction was perfectly executed. The ruined laptop contained his localized, administrative access to the Access Road toll gate security software. He was temporarily, technically blind to the network traffic currently occurring 50 miles outside the city limits. "While Mr. Peterson handles the unfortunate spill," Ion said smoothly, stepping forward and clicking open his leather briefcase with a quiet, sharp, metallic snap, "my client would like to officially address the 2021 exclusivity clause you are currently using to threaten Bennett Botanicals." "Your client?" Cade glared at me, aggressively wiping his ruined pants with a soggy napkin, his chest heaving. "He's a delivery coordinator. He can barely walk across a room without destroying something. Mr. Green is the primary, majority shareholder of the Regional Agricultural Rail Network," Ion corrected softly, his voice carrying the lethal, unwavering precision of a surgical scalpel. "He also holds the primary deed to the undeveloped property directly bordering Henderson Farms. The specific property you incorrectly assumed was protected municipal land when you hastily purchased the access road." Cade froze. The soggy napkin dropped from his hand, hitting the carpet with a soft splat. He looked at my wrinkled linen shirt, then at Ion's pristine, $1,000 suit. He looked at the dead, dripping laptop on the table. The aggressive arrogance slowly drained from his posture. "What?" Cade demanded, the healthy color rapidly draining from his face. "You bought the access road to force a deliberate shipping delay," I said, dropping the clumsy apologetic act entirely. My posture straightened, my voice leveled out, the high-pitched panic vanishing completely, replaced by the cold, heavy, undeniable reality of the leverage I held in my hands. "But my property borders the rear perimeter of Henderson's farm. We laid a temporary, packed gravel service road last night using 2 heavy industrial bulldozers. The delivery truck successfully bypassed your toll gate at exactly 0400 hours this morning. The required volume for the month has already been met and processed at the regional transit hub. Your manufactured breach is entirely neutralized." "That's illegal," Cade snapped, leaning aggressively over the table, planting his hands on the aluminum surface. "You can't lay an unauthorized heavy commercial road across municipal lines in 24 hours without an environmental review. It is officially classified as temporary agricultural tractor access," Ion stated smoothly, sliding a heavily stamped, notarized document across the polished table. "Fully permitted under county zoning laws regarding seasonal harvest transit routes. The route is entirely legal. The delivery is complete. Your exclusivity clause is dead. Bennett Botanicals will not be signing your 30% extortion contract today or ever." Cade stared down at the stamped paper. The massive leverage he had spent an entire year meticulously building evaporated completely in the span of 3 short minutes. He looked at me, his eyes narrowing to angry, desperate slits. "You think this saves her company? I still control the primary East Coast shipping hubs. I'll freeze her out of every major market by winter. She won't be able to move a single pallet past the state line. You control the hubs built directly on land leased from Green AgriCorp, I replied, finally pulling out the chair and taking the seat across from him. I didn't stumble this time. My movements were slow, deliberate, and perfectly balanced. Check your primary commercial ground leases, Cade. They are up for commercial renewal in exactly 60 days. If you delay a single, solitary shipment from Bennett Botanicals, I will legally increase your ground rent by 400% across the board. You will be operating at a massive, unsustainable net loss before Thanksgiving. The silence in the glass room was absolute. The faint, mechanical hum of the air conditioning was the only audible sound. Cade looked at the dripping, dead laptop, then at the zoning permit, then directly at my calm, unblinking face. The reality of his complete tactical defeat settled over the room. We are done here, I said, standing up smoothly, adjusting the wrinkled cuffs of my linen shirt. Ion will forward the revised terms of the standard distribution contract. You will sign it, or you will lose your hubs and face immediate eviction proceedings. I turned and walked out of the glass room, leaving the ruined coffee dripping slowly, methodically onto the expensive carpet. I found Regina back in the botanical garden at precisely 1,400 hours. The ambient humidity in the air was stifling, smelling strongly of wet potting earth, sphagnum moss, and high nitrogen fertilizer. She was standing by the long propagation tables, a heavy wooden clipboard in her hand, rapidly checking inventory tags on a dense row of fragile seedlings. The dark, bruising circles under her eyes were far more pronounced than yesterday. She was vibrating with a terrifying, anxious energy, completely unable to stop her frantic movements. I can't reach Henderson, she said, the very second she saw me, not even bothering to look up from the clipboard. Her pen scratched aggressively against the paper. If Cade stalled the trucks at the toll gate this morning, we are completely out of time. The trucks successfully arrived at the regional hub 3 hours ago, I said, stepping directly into her line of sight, blocking her view of the seedlings entirely. She stopped writing. Her pen hovered motionless over the clipboard. The frantic, mechanical scratching stopped. She stared at the wrinkled linen of my shirt, then down at my heavy work boots, tracing the line of leverage I hadn't explicitly named. Her shoulders dropped an inch, like a heavy, suffocating strap had been suddenly cut, and the paper in her hand stopped shaking. What? How? The access road, she stammered, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. The access road was successfully bypassed via a temporary agricultural service route, I explained, keeping my tone gentle and strictly reassuring. The contractual volume requirement is officially fulfilled. Cade Peterson will be sending over a fully revised distribution contract by the end of the day, permanently dropping his transit rate to 12%. Regina stared at me in total, unadulterated shock. The heavy clipboard slowly lowered to her side, hanging loosely from her grip. The frantic, spinning gears in her brilliant mind hit a sudden, jarring halt. 12%? Beau? He wanted 30. He swore he would ruin me. How did you get him to agree to 12? I engaged in a brief negotiation regarding the terms of his commercial ground leases, I said vaguely, my broad shoulder brushing against a hanging Boston fern. She studied my face intensely. The profound realization that I was not just a simple, clumsy logistics coordinator finally broke through her wall of exhaustion. She saw the heavy, grounded, corporate power I kept carefully hidden beneath the apologetic exterior. You own the ground leases, she whispered, the complex logistical pieces falling rapidly into place. The rail lines, the undeveloped property directly behind Henderson. You aren't just a coordinator, Beau. You're the majority shareholder of the entire regional network. I prefer the term silent partner, I said, rubbing the back of my neck, feeling the sudden, uncomfortable heat of exposure. She didn't look angry about the massive omission. She looked utterly, profoundly overwhelmed. The crushing, suffocating weight of the corporate threat had been completely lifted, and without the raw adrenaline to keep her upright, the severe physical exhaustion hit her instantly. Her knees buckled slightly, her perfect balance failing for the first time. I dropped my own clipboard, the wood clattering loudly against the flagstones, and caught her by the elbows before she could hit the hard path. She was alarmingly light. I steadied her, keeping a respectful, firm distance, my hands gripping her arms securely just below the shoulder joints to keep her upright. I've got you, I said, my voice dropping to a soft, resonant murmur. She leaned her forehead against my chest, just for a fraction of a second. A deep, shuddering sigh tore through her entire frame. I thought I was going to lose it all. My father's company. Everything I spent my life building. You didn't lose it, I said, my grip remaining steady, anchoring her to the ground. But you are going to lose consciousness if you do not rest. Your body is attempting a forced, physiological shutdown. She pulled back slowly, looking up at me, a fragile, deeply exhausted smile touching her pale lips. I can't rest yet. I have to review the revised contract Cade sends over to ensure there are no traps. I have to prep my keynote speech for the gala on Friday. Ayan is thoroughly reviewing the contract as we speak. It is legally bulletproof, I assured her. I slowly let go of her arms, stepping back a full pace to give her the necessary space to breathe. I am placing you on a mandatory 24-hour hold. You will go to your office upstairs. You will lock the heavy door. You will sleep. She shook her head stubbornly, the relentless CEO returning for a brief second. I have critical emails. I have suppliers to call. You have absolutely nothing that cannot wait until tomorrow morning, I interrupted softly, crossing my arms over my chest. The sanctuary is secure, Regina. You don't have to be the boss in this room right now. She looked at the long rows of vibrant, blooming orchids. She looked at the clear, safe path I had secured for her future. Finally, the rigid, painful tension left her shoulders completely. 24 hours, she conceded softly, turning slowly toward the stairs. Thursday afternoon, the storm broke wide open once again. I was standing in the main greenhouse break room, attempting to pour a simple cup of black coffee from the industrial carafe into a ceramic mug. I misjudged the angle entirely, spilling hot, dark liquid across the clean white counter. I grabbed a sponge, cursing my absolute lack of spatial awareness when dealing with fragile objects. The break room door banged open violently. Regina stood in the frame. The healthy color had returned to her face after a full night of sleep, but it wasn't from rest anymore. It was from sheer, unadulterated panic. She held a thick, heavily redacted legal document in her trembling hand. Cade didn't sign the revised contract, she said, her voice shaking with raw, unchecked fear. I stopped wiping the counter. The sponge hovered motionless over the spill. Ayan confirmed receipt of the terms. The leverage regarding the commercial ground leases is absolute. Cade has no viable financial alternative. He found an alternative, she said, walking forward and throwing the thick legal document directly onto the table. It slid straight through the spilled coffee, the edges soaking up the dark liquid, but she didn't even flinch. He didn't sign the distribution contract. He executed a secondary, buried clause in his original transport agreement with Henderson Farms. He bought the farm, Beau. Cade bought the actual, physical land where the hybrids are grown. A cold, heavy sensation pooled instantly in my gut. I reached for the damp document, ignoring the wet coffee stains, my eyes scanning the dense, archaic legal jargon. It was a formal transfer of deed. Henderson didn't mention this possibility, I said, the complex agricultural math rapidly recalculating in my head. Henderson didn't know the ultimate buyer was Omni Distribution. Cade used a blind trust to hide his identity and bypass standard review, Regina explained, her voice rising in pitch. The deed transferred officially this morning. Cade owns the soil now. He doesn't need to distribute my flowers anymore. He can just legally refuse to grow them for my brand entirely. He's cutting off the entire supply at the root. The contract is dead. The company is dead. I stared at the paperwork. The massive distribution victory meant absolutely nothing if the supply vanished overnight. Cade had smartly anticipated the ground lease threat and pivoted rapidly to a harder, much more permanent target. I have to go to the gala tomorrow night, she whispered, leaning heavily against the doorframe, her eyes filling with bright tears she fiercely refused to let fall. I have to stand in front of the executive board, the major investors, the entire industry, and smile while I know I don't have a single product to sell next quarter. We have 36 hours, I said, my voice hardening. The clumsy, gentle persona vanished entirely, replaced by cold, ruthless calculation. I pulled my phone from my pocket. Henderson has a right of first refusal clause embedded in all legacy agricultural transfers in this specific county. I need to see the exact wording of that trust transfer. It's over, Beau, she said softly, crossing her arms protectively. You played a brilliant hand, but Cade had a bigger stack of chips. It is not over, I stated firmly, dialing Ayan's direct line and pressing the phone to my ear. I do not lose agricultural assets to logistical parasites. I spent the next 14 consecutive hours locked in a windowless, heavily secured conference room downtown with Ian and 3 junior legal associates. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with a low, headache-inducing frequency. The air in the room grew stale, smelling strongly of bitter, burnt espresso and dry printer toner. Massive stacks of municipal filings, property tax records, and archaic zoning laws covered every single inch of the massive mahogany table. I loosened my tie, rubbing the dry grit from my burning eyes as the heavy clock on the wall ticked agonizingly past 0200 hours. We cross-referenced every single line of the transaction, searching for a microscopic fracture in Cade's armor. By 3 a.m., Ion's silver pen stopped moving across the legal pad. "There," Ion said quietly, his voice cutting clearly through the heavy exhaustion in the room. The blind trust failed to file the mandatory secondary environmental impact assessment required for transferring hybrid botanical acreage within 72 hours of the initial deed signing. I leaned forward, staring at the glowing monitor, the blurry text finally snapping into sharp focus. The margin of error was razor thin, but it was legally viable. If the assessment isn't filed on time, the county can place an immediate, temporary freeze on the deed transfer. The freeze is temporary until the missing filing is corrected effective immediately, Ion confirmed, nodding sharply. Henderson retains full operational authority during the hold. Cade cannot legally enforce any operational changes or lockouts until the freeze is lifted by a judge. It buys us exactly 14 days. 14 days is a lifetime in agriculture, I said, a slow, dangerous smile finally forming. Draft the injunction immediately. File it physically at the courthouse the exact second the doors open. Friday night, the grand ballroom of the Omni Hotel was packed shoulder to shoulder. The annual Botanical Gala was a high society event disguised as a charity auction. It was a massive, glittering room filled with ruthless, corporate predators, wearing expensive, tailored tuxedos. The crystal chandeliers cast a brilliant light over the crowd, while a string quartet played softly in the corner. I stood near the back wall, holding a crystal glass of sparkling water I was terrified of spilling on a passing guest. I wore a tailored black tuxedo that felt overly restrictive, my broad shoulders tense as I watched the crowd mingle under the heavy lights. Regina stood near the front podium, completely surrounded by powerful board members and wealthy investors. She wore a floor-length crimson gown, formal, structured, built for a podium. It wasn't designed for allure. It was designed as impenetrable armor. She looked powerful, untouchable, and utterly exhausted beneath the flawless makeup. She was performing. She was playing the demanding role of the highly successful CEO, hiding the devastating, crushing knowledge that her supply chain was theoretically severed. I watched closely as Cade Peterson confidently strode through the dense crowd, heading directly toward her circle. He held a delicate flute of champagne, his smile wide and deeply predatory. He thought he had won the war. He thought the farm was entirely his. I set my water glass down carefully on a passing waiter's silver tray. I moved swiftly through the dense crowd, my long strides eating up the distance smoothly. I did not stumble. I did not apologize to the people I bumped past. I reached Regina exactly as Cade stepped into her immediate circle. "Regina?" "Darling." Cade purred smoothly, speaking loudly enough for the surrounding investors to hear every word. "I was just telling the board members about the sudden transition at Henderson Farms. It's a terrible shame about your incoming supply chain disruption. But Omni is always willing to discuss a generous buyout if you find yourself needing a sudden exit strategy." Regina's jaw tightened visibly. She maintained her polished, perfect smile, but the raw panic flared briefly in her dark eyes. She was trapped in the public spotlight, unable to defend herself without confirming the devastating rumor. I stepped up smoothly beside her, inserting myself directly into the circle. I didn't announce myself. I simply handed her a crisp, white envelope with the heavy, embossed county courthouse seal stamped clearly on the front. The environmental assessment freeze was officially confirmed by a judge at 1,600 hours today, I said, my voice carrying clearly over the ambient, buzzing noise of the ballroom. I looked directly into Cade's eyes. "The deed transfer for Henderson Farms is suspended indefinitely by municipal order. Your blind trust is completely frozen." Cade's confident smile vanished instantly. The champagne glass in his hand tilted dangerously, spilling over the rim. "What?" You failed to file the mandatory secondary impact forms, I explained clinically, watching the arrogant blood drain completely from his face. The land legally remains under Henderson's operational control. We had Henderson's signature ready. The moment the county issued the hold, he was legally able to execute the supply agreement. And, Mr. Henderson, I pulled a second, thicker document from my inside jacket pocket, signed an exclusive, ironclad 10-year supply contract with Bennett Botanicals exactly 3 hours ago. The price locked in at current market value. The surrounding investors murmured loudly, the power dynamic in the circle shifting instantly as they realized Cade had just lost a massive, highly public play. Regina took the white envelope. She read the cover sheet. The realization hit her, breaking completely through the exhaustion. Her shoulders dropped an inch, like a heavy strap had been suddenly cut, and the paper in her hand stopped shaking. The board chairman stepped up, his eyes darting between Cade and the documents. Regina, who exactly secured this legacy contract? Omni was handling the negotiations. Regina did not hesitate. She did not hide me in the background as a simple coordinator. She turned, placing her hand firmly on my forearm in front of the entire executive circle, claiming the victory and the partnership publicly. This is Beau Green, she stated, her voice ringing with absolute, unwavering clarity. He is the majority shareholder of Green Agricorp, and as of tonight, the official logistical and supply partner of Bennett Botanicals. I trust his oversight implicitly. Cade stared at the documents, his face flushed with hot, undeniable humiliation. He had played his trump card in a public arena, attempting to force a surrender, and I had detonated his entire strategy in front of the very people he desperately needed to impress. He turned without a single word and shoved his way back through the dense crowd, disappearing quickly toward the exit. The circle grew quiet as the immediate, crushing threat evaporated. The investors politely dispersed, sensing the tension had resolved entirely in Regina's favor, leaving us a small pocket of privacy. Regina stood holding the heavy paperwork. The immense, crushing pressure of the last 2 brutal weeks was finally, permanently gone. She looked at the signed contract, then up at my face. "You saved the company," she said, her voice trembling slightly. I corrected a paperwork error. I deflected gently, rubbing the back of my neck, suddenly feeling entirely out of place in the expensive tuxedo. "Stop downplaying it, Beau," she said softly. She stepped closer. "You didn't have to do this. You could have walked away when Cade bought the farm. You didn't owe me a 14-hour legal battle." "I don't walk away from things that matter," I said honestly. She looked up at me, her eyes dark and incredibly soft in the dim light of the ballroom. The strict professional boundary we had maintained for 2 years was gone, shattered completely by the weight of what we had just survived together. Later that evening, we returned to the silent, empty greenhouse. The air was thick with humidity, smelling heavily of damp earth and blooming orchids. I pulled a small vial of mineral oil and an Allen wrench from my tuxedo pocket. I walked over to the heavy glass door, carefully adjusting the hydraulic dampener and applying the oil to the stiff, rusted joints. I pushed the door open. It glided shut completely silently, sealing perfectly against the frame without a single rattle. Regina stood near the potting bench, watching me work. She had taken off the painful heels, standing barefoot on the cool flagstones. "I couldn't stop thinking about you last night," she admitted, her voice barely a breath, carrying the raw, vulnerable truth of the adrenaline crash. "I was terrified we were going to lose, but I kept picturing you standing in that boardroom with Cade. I wanted you here." The sentence hit me like a physical blow. A sudden, intense heat flared at the back of my neck. My throat went entirely dry. I looked down at her, seeing the sheer, incredible courage it took for her to admit that vulnerability after constantly needing to be the strongest person in the room. I wanted to close the distance instantly. I wanted to pull her against me, but I looked at the dark, heavy circles under her eyes, the slight, swaying exhaustion in her posture. She was running purely on fumes, fueled only by the massive relief of survival. I kept my hands firmly at my sides, my fingers curling into tight fists to prevent myself from crossing that boundary. I swallowed hard, forcing my voice to remain perfectly steady. "Not tonight," I said softly, stepping back just a fraction to give her the space she desperately needed to breathe. "Go home. Lock the door. Sleep for 12 hours without setting an alarm. Tomorrow, when your mind is completely clear, when the adrenaline is entirely gone, and you know your legacy is safe, I will come over, and we will review the terms. She stared at me, her eyes wide, slowly understanding the massive amount of discipline it took to offer her that specific boundary. She recognized the fierce protection in the delay. I wasn't rejecting her. I was demanding she take the soft landing she desperately needed. A slow, beautiful smile broke across her face. It was the first truly relaxed expression I had seen on her in weeks. Tomorrow, she agreed softly. On my phone, Ayan's email landed with a quiet chime. The partnership addendum signed, stamped, effective Monday. Overhead, the automated misting system clicked on with a quiet hiss, showering the orchids with a fine, gentle rain, filling the silent sanctuary with the undeniable scent of permanence. The end. Closing thoughts, I learned that love isn't about holding on tight to control every variable. It's about knowing they will come back if you let go and give them the space to rest. Real love is consistent, safe, and proves itself through discipline, not just desire. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this.